Hey, Posey, do you want to introduce me so we can get started with the show?
Sarah and the kids. My mom. My daddy. My daddy.
I'm not your daddy. Who am I?
Mommy.
You're listening to the Read-Aloud Revival podcast. This is the podcast that inspires you to build your family culture around books. I'm Sarah McKenzie, and you've got episode 9 of the Read-Aloud Revival podcast. This is the show dedicated to giving you the motivation and the tools you need to build a family culture around books by reading aloud to your children. The show has been downloaded over 40,000 times in these first few months of launching. Wow, you guys are amazing. Thank you so much for sharing about the show on social media, telling your friends, and if you are gearing up to head back to school for the year, you can print a flyer for your school, for your teachers, by visiting readaloudrevival.com. Now, today's show is sponsored by Audible. You can find great audiobooks for your kids, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Anne of Green Gables. You can put them on in the car while you're on the road, or listen during lunchtime, or even let your kids listen while they have some downtime in their room to give you a much-needed midday break. Visit audibletrial.com/readaloud to get a free audiobook and a 30-day trial of Audible's audiobook services. That's audibletrial.com/readaloud. I am super excited about the fall because I have lined up some awesome guests to come onto the show and talk with me. You can see a list. I always keep a running list of upcoming guests at readaloudrevival.com. So we've got people like Dr. Anthony Esselin, Sarah Clarkson. Oh my goodness, just a whole roster of really awesome interviews coming up. So it's going to be a fabulous fall at the Read Aloud Revival. I'm really excited about it. Today, I'm happy to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. Dr. Pakaluk is an assistant professor of economics at Ave Maria University in Southwest Florida. She holds a doctorate and a master's degree from Harvard University. Yes, I did say Harvard, and is the mother of 7 young children. I'm interested in talking to Dr. Pakaluk because she has a unique perspective as both a mother of many and an accomplished college professor. Today, we're going to be talking about the role that reading aloud plays in the lives of our kids as they grow older and pursue college education, and what value it might offer for children who we wouldn't otherwise consider literary or bookish. I think it's going to be a great chat. So, hi, Dr. Pakaluk. Thank you so much for taking my call today.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm honored to chat with you. So, could we start by having you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your family?
Sure, no problem. Let's see. I've been married for 15 years. 15 years next month in August.
Okay.
And we're very much looking forward to celebrating that anniversary. My husband and I are both college professors. When we met, I was still in graduate school, so we've been kind of thinking about books and learning, kind of our whole relationship. So something we spend a lot of time thinking about in my household. Where we live now, we're famous for having actually a floor-to-ceiling library in one part of our home.
Oh, awesome.
And so you can't even get to the top shelves because they're 10 feet up.
That's awesome.
Which we had someone build in for us because we just didn't have enough bookshelves or tall enough bookshelves.
It's such a wise use of that space that's totally wasted,
yeah,
right?
I mean, what good is it? I know, and then the kids think that there's these like special books that are way up there that maybe someday they'll come to read. So yeah, obviously with the, my husband's a philosopher. His degrees are in philosophy, and mine are in kind of economics, and I study more, family issues and social issues. I do a lot of work in social thought as well as economics. And so, the love of learning and study is really something deeply imbued in my household, and that we think about, how to learn all the time. So we're kind of doing this reflective thing constantly, and kind of we're getting, we're reading, and then we're reading about reading, and then we're reading about reading about reading, and this is sort of something that kind of makes up a kind of quirky but we think lovable character of our home. And so, our kids' friends all know this, so the kids the neighborhood kids come over to play with our kids, and this has been true as long as we've been raising children together. So that, the neighborhood kids come over to our house in the summer, and our kids are all sitting there. They've got to do their 2 or 3 hours of reading in the morning. And so the neighborhood kids will come over and be like, hey, grab a book. You're going to have to read if you want to play with so-and-so.
Oh, that's too funny.
We've kind of been known for that. That's this sort of style of parenting for a long time. So that is a little bit about us, and, kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of where we're both coming from.
That's great. So as a college professor, I'm wondering what you see reading aloud, how you see that as playing a part in specific, not just reading to themselves, but reading aloud to our kids. How do you think that plays a role in getting kids ready for college or helping them succeed in college, or how do you think that relates, or do you think it does?
So in preparing for this this interview and this podcast, I was thinking, what could I bring to the table as an economist? And I've been eager to sort of share with you the work of one of my close colleagues who does a lot of actual work on sort of studying the actual effects of reading aloud to your children, which is, as you said, different from just reading. And I don't know if it's something you've already covered in your podcast. So I'll just mention his name, Joseph Price.
No, we
as
haven't.
An economist. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, this is just great stuff. Joseph Price is an economist at Brigham Young University in Provo, and he's someone I've worked with, in different projects. But some of the most interesting research that I think that he's done in his career as an economist, he's actually looked at kind of time use data and a lot of the national data sets that look both at kind of what is going on in the home, what are parents actually doing with their children in the course of a day. Are they okay? Now they're turning on a TV show. Now they're having dinner. Now they're reading aloud. Right. So if you look at a lot of families, you might get a number of them that are reading aloud at certain points in time. And then, you'll also have access to sort of the children's outcomes. How do they do in school? Do they go to college? That kind of thing, right? So you can start to envision what you could actually look for. So Joe has done a lot of work looking at precisely that, kind of the effects of parents reading aloud to their children. And he's produced stunning data, which kind of shows empirically, which isn't the only form of proof, but it's a good one. It shows empirically that reading aloud specifically to your children, dramatically raises test scores, dramatically raises performance later in life in college, and that kind of thing. If you'd like later at the end, I could forward you some of the links to some of the descriptions of his papers.
That'd be great.
For example, here's one statistic from one of his papers: 1 extra day per week of parent-child reading during the first 10 years of life increases test scores, like standardized test scores, by a half of a standard deviation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now, a half of a standard deviation, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, depending on the test, a standard deviation could be anywhere between, 15 percentile points on a standardized test, or even as many as 20 or 30. So a half of a standard deviation could be, we could be talking about 5 to 10 percentile points on a standardized test. So we're talking about like that extra day of reading in the child's early years, like before the age of 10, could mean the difference between your kid, shooting a 75th percentile and an 85th percentile, right? And that's a massive difference. So these are really big differences. And so I do a lot of work in what we would call the economics of education. I know the literature very, very well. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that effects of that magnitude, we don't see them very often.
Really? Okay.
We don't see them very often. So to put this in perspective, the kinds of things that a lot of economists go look for when you look at raising students' test scores, right? This is like the holy grail. You'd like to raise all kids' test scores, right? We'd like every kid to be above average, right? This is the thing, right? And so you go out and you think, well, what could you check for? What could you look for? What are the kinds of policy things that people care about? So when I'm trying to put this effect in perspective for you, I'm saying, well, okay, think about maybe a policy that might reduce class sizes in a whole system or a whole district, for example. So maybe you can lower class sizes from 25 children in the classroom to 22, for example.
Okay.
There are mixed results on that. Some of them seem to modestly raise test scores. Some of them don't seem to do any good at all. So for example, the evidence on class sizes is very, very mixed. It's very complex. But even the best studies, the ones which show the largest effects for lowering class sizes, don't show effects on the order of half of a standard deviation.
Wow.
Right? So
okay.
This is, I'm trying to kind of give you a sense, or like,
yeah, well, because we
other,
always talk about that, lowering class sizes being such a huge improvement for. Yeah. But if it's something so simple as just reading to our children one more day a week, that's amazing.
Exactly. So 1 extra day per week. And, you're not talking about, no one in the data set is reading, 6 hours a day. So we're, so this isn't necessarily something tremendously burdensome. It means if you've been used to reading, when you do a day of reading aloud, are you doing 30 minutes? Are you doing 15? Are you doing an hour? Whatever that is, if you add one more day of that, that's the kind of boost we're talking about.
Wow,
and it should be said that in as far as is possible in this data, Joel will be controlling for things like income and the educational background of the parents. So this is an effect that you're seeing after already saying, oh, well, that one's mom has a PhD and this one's mom, doesn't. So this is on top of that. That's even if you've got the PhD and even if you have, good income and you live in a nice place. So these are big effects, and they're really interesting, and they're very interesting in a climate where we have this, we speak very often about an educational crisis, and we don't know how America's kids are not learning and they can't read, and there's all, and that you've got hundreds of researchers all over the country chasing after what could produce larger effects, and this is a really clear. Wow, that's a huge effect. One can do this.
Yeah. Now, so when it comes to college students who've been read aloud to, do you think you can kind of tell when you're working with college students if they come from a family that has done a lot of reading or not, or is it not really that overt?
That's a really interesting question. Can I see in the classroom a difference between the students who've done a lot of reading and the ones who haven't? And there isn't a college professor in this country who wouldn't agree to that proposition. You can always see it. You can see it a number of ways. One of the ways you see it when when people have been read to and have been, we'll just say, from a very strong reading culture in the home. If you allow me to kind of conflate these two for a minute, because with my professional hat on, I don't know if I can distinguish always between the reading aloud and the reading.
Right.
But what you see a lot of what professors all around the country are complaining about is that students don't have the ability to actually read. Not just that they can't read the words on the page, but that if you want to assign them 200 pages of a novel or a piece of work for a week, which would be pretty standard, they can't get through it. They can't get through it, process it. And you see the kids who've been reading all their lives. It's like that's not an issue. And so what a lot of colleges are doing is a lot of this remedial work where you're in some sense like they haven't learned to swim.
Yeah.
Like they can read a paragraph and maybe answer appropriate questions. Like they can pass the standardized test. But can they really read at this adult level? And so you're not really seeing it. To your point about reading aloud, though, are you seeing a difference there? One of the most clear ways where you can see the difference in the kids who do read, who have been read to, is actually their ability to speak with confidence in the classroom. So we have all, myself included, had this experience where you ask students to read things in class. You want to have a seminar discussion, you say, let's read this passage aloud. And the book goes around the room, and it's sort of discouraging that the book stops. So many students who test fairly well are not capable of actually themselves reading aloud.
Oh, interesting.
They trip on how to pronounce words, and it's amazing that you think, okay, wow, you're in college, and that word, you're not sure how to pronounce it. So that's, I think there's probably a very large connection between being read to and actually kind of oral presentation and kind of some of the, I wouldn't say rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is building an argument through your speech, but it's kind of a requirement for rhetoric, which is even being able to pronounce words correctly.
Well, this reminds me of, in the very first episode of this podcast, I talked to Andrew Pudua from the Institute for Excellence in Writing, and he talks about needing to hear from the auditory through your ear, properly formed and highly sophisticated language patterns. And he tells this story. I don't remember if he told it on the podcast or if I've heard him tell it somewhere else, but he tells this story of his daughter who reads copiously, right? In the airport with him, and she asks him, are we going on Horizon Airlines? And he cannot figure out what she's talking about until he realizes she means Horizon. But she's read it probably a million times, but it's not usually a word we use in casual conversation, I can see that. How
that's right. You have to hear the words. Facetious.
Yeah.
It's one of those words. If you haven't heard it, you're going to say fastidious, right? But and you can kind of keep going down the list. And and there's almost nothing more than mispronouncing a common word, that will cause someone to look at you and put you in a category of stupid or uneducated.
Right.
It's one of the, it's probably the first, besides just your kind of physical appearance and personal hygiene, it's one of the first ways that people put you in a box.
Right.
And so we want not to put have our children be in those boxes. It does mean, though, I will say this, as far as parents reading aloud in that respect, it does mean that it is, my husband's wonderful at this. I am a little less wonderful. My husband is, we actually have to kind of maintain this collective governance over the English language, and we actually have to make sure we're pronouncing things as well as we can. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of learning we have to do. And one of the ways we've tried to correct ourselves as much as possible, and I was going to say, I don't know how much you've explored this in your podcast, is actually kind of making heavy use of books read on tape.
Which
is another kind of reading aloud. But there are many people. It's it's more than right. There's more than a kind of skill. There's an art to read. And so we frequently will experiment with books read aloud on tape read by people with very different accents than an American accent. We will like an Australian accent or a British accent or an Indian British accent. And you kind of run through those, and that actually it really helps the children by hearing a variety of ways of saying a word. It helps them to kind of actually zero in on the way we're supposed to be saying the word.
Right.
And that's something that I think, so anyway, this all goes back to your point about kind of professional success. And so I think there's a lot of different channels for that, but it's pretty critical to kind of speaking, language, oral presentation, and making a good impression, making the impression the right impression, right? I mean, we've all known people who were kind of geniuses, and almost, this is almost a stereotype of geniuses, that they're sort of geniuses, but like they can't do, they're dressed badly, or they can't comb their hair, or,
Yeah.
So, I mean, the world does make allowances for some of that. Or I had a student here at the university who was one of the brightest students I've ever taught, but had a congenital lisp and couldn't control. And so, the world does make allowances for those things. One shouldn't be hung up, but this is very important. Learning how to
it's kind of like spelling, right? So if someone can be really articulate, but if they spell things wrong, it kind of gives the wrong impression. So I also think audiobooks help me become better at reading aloud.
A better reader. Absolutely.
I also talked to Jim Weiss for the podcast on a few earlier episodes from Great Hall Productions. He has done. He's so talented, and that helps me when I'm listening to any kind of audio.
I would also say that the reading aloud is going to make a huge difference, particularly in the reading of poetry. And again, you probably have explored this at length, and I'm no poet nor no expert on poetry, but this is a clear place where this is meant to be read aloud. This is not meant to be read on the page.
If our listeners are wondering for some good recommendations, the show notes for episode 7 at readaloudrevival.com have some excellent titles there to choose from, good collections that she recommends. But I am trying to ramp up the poetry in our own home because I have not been properly, attuned to love poetry well. But my oldest daughter loves poetry, so I really want to run with that. Yeah.
No, I'm kind of in the same place. I didn't study a lot of poetry, never in college, just a little bit in high school. So I'm not. It's not the place I'm most comfortable. But we have really was when I came to work here at the university, being a liberal arts college. We have some professors who really teach poetry, and they really love and understand poetry. So I've been trying to grow and study alongside these faculty, kind of learn something that I didn't ever learn the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say for your readers, just a kind of a good example. I had read many of Robert Frost's poems when I was growing up, as many Americans do, or were exposed to Robert Frost. We have a professor here, a great professor of literature, who is himself a great fan of Robert Frost, and he is fond of having dinners and evenings where people just read poetry aloud. And again, I don't have any memorized. He has dozens and dozens, hundreds of poems. He can just sit for hours and recite poetry.
Oh, what a gift! Oh my goodness.
So and he's somebody I'd love to connect you with in the future. But in any case, recently we were at dinner with him, and we asked him to read aloud one of his favorites from Frost, and he read this poem, which I have not been too familiar with, but I had heard it before, which is called "Never Again Would Birds' Song Be the Same." And just to hear someone who was, really expert at reading poetry aloud, when he read this poem, I I almost broke down at the end. I mean, it's a short poem that if you read it on the page, you may or may not be completely moved by it, but the difference between how I had understood it before I heard him speak it and after I heard him speak it was tremendous.
Wow.
And it really kind of I really went home with my pencil and I thought, okay, I have got to start. We have to change this up. We have got to do more reading aloud of poetry. So,
well, maybe that's why I haven't really loved it. Is I haven't done a lot of reading aloud or heard a lot of it read aloud. The only exposure I've had to poetry is what I've read on the page, and it does sort of kind of lay flat there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like poetry's like it's like fine wine or classical music. It's a sort of thing that you have to be educated to appreciate. And so, if I pick up the poetry of Robert Frost and just start reading it, it stands to reason I should be less successful than a professor of literature who's lived his whole life kind of deeply imbued in Robert Frost. There's very different. So it would be very disappointing if that weren't the case. And certainly Shakespeare is the same. I mean, Shakespeare's not meant to be read on the page. We often forget that Shakespeare is poetry.
Yes.
And this is true for a great many, like the epic poems of the ancients. Again, these are not. We actually did was it 2 years ago? The university sponsored a 24-hour like round the clock Homerathon where there was a 24-hour reading of the Iliad. Just kind of all night long, and it was like so students would take shifts and they read this. And the last hour was taken by someone who's done a famous translation.
Oh wow! Okay.
From I forgot what his name is, but it was just a great event. And again, the sort of thing that we just in this culture, because we're so visual, we have forgotten the importance of the oral, AURAL, right? The oral tradition, and the importance of reading and passing things on aloud. And it's something I have had to be, I think, as much corrected in as probably many others. We think it's easier and faster to digest information visually, and it is faster and easier, but it's not necessarily we're not actually getting to the same point, right?
Yeah.
We're not actually
Doesn't
doing
provide
the
same value.
thing.
Yeah. So as a professor of economics, can you speak a little bit to a parent who says their child's maybe not, they wouldn't peg that child as literary, or that child might grow up saying, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a math professor, or just sort of being inclined more to the sciences or math or business.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One, in part because I was that child who was a little bit more inclined to the science and math. So I went to this high school that was very strong in the classical liberal arts, and very weak-ish in the math and sciences. So let's just that's the background. Then I went to a big traditional Ivy League school with a lot of math and science, and of course I jumped right into the math and science side of the university, and so a couple of things happened in the first year. And right away, what I learned was that because remember I thought that I got there by the skin of my teeth, and that more or less I was completely disadvantaged compared to all these other kids who've gone to these big public schools with huge math science programs and stuff. And so one thing that happened in the first year that I was there was really interesting. So I noticed that in the first couple of weeks, I was the other students did seem a little bit more kind of with it, like they weren't. I was kind of learning everything from scratch. But in terms of content, what they had already covered, the course goes so quickly at the college level. It's not the same. By about 2 or 3 weeks in, we were all at the same place, kind of all equally drowning or treading water. So the little advantage they had from earlier exposure to sophisticated science or math seemed to disappear within about a month. And then what happened was very interesting. A month later, when you get to that place where you're producing work, studying a lot, and even memorizing terms in science, for example, and writing up lab reports, the tables switched around very quickly to where my classmates were coming to me. How are you doing well on these lab reports? How are you writing them up? Can you show me what you're doing? I keep getting C's in my lab reports, and these are kids with the AP science classes, and so
interesting.
And all of a sudden, it kind of hit me. And it was like 2 or 3 months into my freshman year. It kind of hit me, and I thought, oh wow, okay, because you hear the things that you hear about the liberal arts, and so this is sort of an apology for the, but I mean it's kind of this is this thing where I spent a lot more time in high school reading and doing and reading and writing, if you will, than I did doing the science and math. So then it hit me. I thought, okay, this is the point. The point is not that you're reading because you just really want to be always doing literature. The point is that does this thing to the brain. Yeah. And it does this thing to the way we think about information, the way we kind of present things, which is inherently superior than mastering kind of recipes of skills, which is what the content of modern science is, generally speaking. It's inherently superior. So I was able to take a set of skills which I had not formerly applied to science and scientific inquiry and succeed much more easily than my peers who had only spent their high school years mastering sort of recipe-like techniques. And it was that moment. It was sort of the end of my the fall semester of my freshman year. I kind of thought, I resolved. I said, I'm never ever going to complain or have a negative thought about my education again. I remember I even called my mom and I said, I know I was really a pain in high school, complaining about how you didn't send me to like a science high school. And I said, but I get it, and I'm actually really grateful.
Wow.
And that was it. It was over. Like from that moment on, I was like an apologist for the liberal arts.
Okay, this is so fascinating
profound.
to me.
Yeah, it was so profound. It was so clear and profound, and I thought, okay, I'm so grateful. And that thing is a very interesting thing, and I'm not sure that we fully understand it, but we see it, which has to do with the way that language actually kind of provides an architecture for the symbolic, logical abilities of the brain. But if you spend a lot of time with good authors, with good writing, hearing it a lot, that you're working on the logical side of the brain. So for those parents who have children who are more inclined to the sciences, engineering, it's imperative not to neglect the humanities side, the reading side, and the linguistic side. Questions.
So it was like the liberal arts and the steeping yourself in the literature and the written word. It was the training to help you learn how to think well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so often, like right now, especially our culture seems to be kind of that science and math obsessed with all this STEM stuff.
Yeah, all the STEM stuff. Exactly.
Yeah. But I think if we can kind of thinking about reading aloud as the best preparation for learning how to think, then we can see the value translate into academic work outside of the language arts. So So what about as our children grow older, do you think the value of being read to diminishes as they're getting older? Or, I mean, for example, do you think it would be more worthwhile to read to a 5-year-old who can't read to herself than to a 15-year-old who can? Or do they serve different purposes from your perspective?
So what we see in the data, like Joe Price's work on reading aloud to children, who he sees the biggest effects in terms of kind of what you can measure. And I'm going to really emphasize that in terms of what you can measure in the children. The biggest effects are kind of for the under 10s, like the 10 and unders. That's where you're really seeing, like, if you want to really catapult, change their future, in terms of what can be measured. That's where the reading to the 5-year-old who can't read. I mean, that's what you're really seeing there. But I would say, again, when I think about my children that I've raised who are much older now, that the reading to the 15-year-old is not something to be discounted. But I think that its primary function or its role at that age is sort of a different one.
Okay.
And it's a lot to do with relationship and the kind of the bonds that we can form with our children. And I'll give you one small little example just to kind of shore that one up. That when I first married my husband, he had 6 children who were grieving the loss of their first mother, and I was young, and I was in my 20s, and I didn't know how. I didn't have a lot of means at my disposal. Didn't know, like, how do you just sort of start being a mom to a bunch of kids that you don't you don't know very well, and they don't know you very well, and so I had this kind of idea. Well, what do moms do? Well, moms like read to their kids. That's something you should do. So with my girls, especially my step girls, we don't use the language of step very often, but my older adopted girls, if you will, I started reading them at night, all kinds of things. I just kind of, we read a lot of the typical ones, like we read Narnia, and we read, Tolkien, and we read a lot of the sort of typical literary things, but also read like hero stories and biographies and stories of saints and just, things I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
And I would really want, I really want, and I think they would say the same if you were to interview them. We all look back on those years when, I didn't have babies yet, and I was just reading to them every night. It's kind of like the space in which our relationship was forged.
Oh wow! Right.
They would get into bed, and even the ones at that time they weren't 5. But even the older daughter who's 12. I mean, she was a little bit older, and sometimes the older boys would creep in. But they get into their beds and they've got a blanket, and I don't know if anyone's ever done this research. I think there's positive endorphins, it's like something really good physiologically and emotionally happens.
Yeah.
They're kind of sitting there and they're relaxed, and you're reading. And I really feel like that was how I was able to kind of initiate and form a motherly bond with my adopted children who we didn't have we had no bond to start with. It was like just starting from nothing.
Right.
So those first few years, I mean, we all look back on them because then I had babies and like it got much harder to do the consistent every night reading. But for a long time there, it was like every single night,
I know what that's like because I have an older set and a younger set, and boy, yeah.
It was different amounts of time. I know. You feel so sorry for those later kids, but of course, as even Joe Price would point out and others, and then of course what happens is, those same girls that I read to when they were that age, they ended up turning around and doing the reading for the younger ones more often than I was able to. So it does pass itself on. But I think, I would also say this to parents who may be struggling with a teenage relationship that isn't going as well as they wanted to. Or forget about the teenagers, like the preteens.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That I kind of think it's like this magical thing that you can do that if the relationship isn't so bad that they're not willing to sit at the table. But I'd often find that like the 12-year-old who was kind of ambivalent about me at the time, whereas the 6 and 8-year-old, they didn't care. They were just so happy to have a mom who was going to read to them.
Right.
But like the 12-year-old would say she wasn't going to come listen, but then she would come in and like it was like she'd come in after the reading started and kind of creep in.
Yeah.
That it's just this magical thing, and it's so simple. And if you did it it's like they experience it as love, and it's a beautiful thing. And so I do think like when we're talking about the teenagers or the older kids, when we're not in the realm of thinking about like, gee, we want to raise their test scores or change the future of their life or something,
right.
That these relationship things, it's a kind of very beautiful and important thing that it's like there's a couple of things like in my grab bag of like tricks, maternal tricks at this point.
Yeah.
And that is just one of them. It's like the top one is like really high up there. The next one down is taking a road trip. So
man, really?
Yikes.
I just got back from a road trip. But
oh, you did? It didn't work? No, but they have to be like teenagers. It's not like...
Okay, so the problem
like
was my husband had to ride in a different car because he had to go back to work early, and I have 3 that are 2 and under, and so...
Oh, no,
yeah.
that's...
There was no forging of good relationships there.
No, it's necessarily a road trip as much as taking drives with your teenagers, and it's one of those things that's up in my book of
I read that somewhere else too, where they said,
because you don't have to look at each other. Yeah. This is the key thing, right? So you can bring up all kinds of things that are awkward or uncomfortable, and you don't have to see each other in the eyes.
That's so great.
It makes it really easy to start. But that's now we're really off the subject. But yeah, reading aloud.
That's my favorite way to connect with my kids, I think.
And on the other end, you didn't ask me about the 2-year-olds or you said about 5 or 15, but like the 1-year-olds or the 2-year-olds who, clearly have no idea what you're saying, but they crawl right up under your lap. They're very engaged, really interested. It doesn't matter if there's any pictures or not.
Yeah.
It's like if there's reading going on, you do not want to be left out. It's like, get me into this,
Yep. That's been my experience too.
It is amazing.
How much priority do you think busy parents should try to realistically read aloud? Or what have you experienced in your own life as a working mom? Because you've got a busy life.
Well, so I think, I'm assuming like many busy moms and working moms that, there's a kind of, with all of the various good things we try to do in our lives, be it prayer or attention to, our family, that you kind of go through these phases where you drop off and then you kind of have to pull yourself back and kind of remember, like get recentered. And, I will certainly say that for me, reading aloud is that kind of a thing where, as I've had more babies and had kind of more demands on my time, it's been something that I've had to kind of call myself back to. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, and certainly I would say that I do think it's kind of like for me, it's kind of up there, like in the, it's not like in that list of like, well, here's 20 really good things if you had time for, go to museums and read to your kids. Like for me, it's like over in that other category of like, you got to be reading to your kids. And you got to or having dinner together as a family. That's one of those things that's so easy to start to slip away, and yet we know it's so important. So for me, it's not one of the 20; it's one of the 3 or 4. That's kind of. Is it a struggle to make that time? Yeah, of course it is. So if you're really, really busy, okay, all you have is 5 minutes before the kids go to bed, but there has to be the 5 minutes. So there's got to be like a chunk that is happening. Does it have to be every single day? I mean, no, I don't think so. It just has to be enough that like your kids would remember, yeah, mom did that. Not because it's important that they remember that they were read to, but like if your kids wouldn't characterize their childhood as experiencing reading, then you didn't actually succeed.
And I think a lot of times we kind of have this idea that we either have to do a huge amount or none at all. Well, I kind of tend to be all or nothing. But I was recently thinking about this. The other day I was in the car. I don't know why it hit me, but just sort of out of nowhere, I thought, I wonder how much it would add up to over a year if 5 minutes a day adds up to over a year.
Right.
And so
Right.
I did the calculations. And of course, if you spend 5 minutes a day doing whatever, prayer or reading aloud for 365 days, that's 30 hours in the course of a year. And that's amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So, I mean, if you were going to say like, well, okay, wait, like, just give me a number. Like, I would say, 15 minutes a day. And if you were hitting 4 or 5 days a week, I'd be like, that's a pretty healthy habit.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's like a chapter, I think, about 15 minutes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think, 15 minutes is a chapter. Exactly. It's somewhere, give or take. And, do you have to hit, look, we're not all going to read on Saturday nights. We're going to go out. We're going to do something, maybe even not Friday nights. But if we're doing, something, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or, minus one of those days, 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
I think then you're well on your way to a habit. And you think about exercise that way too, right? I mean, anything that's that important in your life, that's that's almost like a rule of thumb. It's like 15 minutes, 4 or 5 times a day. If you're exercising that way, most of us would be much closer to our ideal, fitness level.
Yeah, and I think it's like the small habits that we do consistently that seem to make the biggest change, or make we have to work up less gusto too, to kind of like now it's time to read aloud if it's just something we do a little bit.
Exactly.
I don't know. I know if I think I have to carve out an hour for something, it's more likely to be pushed aside. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So do you have any tips or tricks for fitting more time in for reading, or what does reading aloud look like in your home?
So I would say probably my best tip or trick is sort of to rethink when you do it over time. So I used to always do it before the kids went to bed at night. That is not working anymore for us because I am too tired. That's sort of the answer. I mean, like I get to that point and I'm so tempted to just kind of change it or switch it or, whatever. So now, I do have the freedom in the schedule because I'm homeschooling and my little ones are home more of the day. So now it's easier to kind of put it in the morning or at a time when I'm not like completely exhausted. So I am much more likely to do the reading like after breakfast. We've cleaned up the breakfast dishes and like, okay, now we'll sit down and, or if I'm super, super busy and like I can't manage it, well, that's when I'll put on the book on tape so that there is sort of like, well, even if mom isn't going to sit on the couch, there's going to be a book on tape or my goodness, the podcast. I mean, I'm not really into the podcast universe, but, I'm trying to remember, we discovered one when I was still homeschooling my older girls, which must have been one of the original, like, read aloud podcasts.
Okay.
They're called Story Nori.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they're still up.
They're still up, but they were, like, back in the good old days. And of course, they ran out of classics. There was a point at which it was like, okay, now you're reading stuff that I'm not sure I really want to, like, throw up. But for a couple of years there, we would use those pretty heavily because, or what we would do, and a lot of times I'll still do this, is just read aloud during mealtime, especially lunchtime. I mean, again, like if your kids are at school during the day, okay, then you can actually read aloud during dinner time. That's not it's not that thing where you imagine, like, not what I did when my older kids were little, like where they're all cuddled in bed and I'm not falling asleep.
Right.
but I would say, like, we often do it over lunchtime because, it's just a great, like, if you don't, what's happening at lunchtime? Sometimes it's just, like craziness or
squabbling. Yeah.
So then I'll just eat afterwards, or I'll eat before and I'll read, or we'll put on the podcast or somebody else reading aloud.
I was going to mention that books, I think books should be free, or I think it's bookshouldbefree.com. I'll look it up and link it up in the show notes, but there's a ton of free audio classics there. And I think a lot of those are on podcast, kind of in podcast form. Like when you go to the website, you can download them really well, easy. I
really do think that kind of the classic, if you can do it, and if you're not like totally exhausted, is to kind of read when your kids are actually in bed. I just think it's a beautiful, great thing, or, the proverbial, like reading around the fireplace, it's just really great. But I was going to say the other thing I've also done when I'm really tired and if I wanted to do the reading at night, it's kind of like you trick yourself into something. You're like, I'm so tired. And I say to myself, okay, instead of going where the kids are in bed, we're going to go to mom's bed. And, people are different about that. But sometimes I'll do this as a kind of, and I have found it's like one of those magic tricks, like inviting the children in to sit on mommy and daddy's big bed when I'm reading. It helps me because then I'm like exhausted, but I can kind of recline and it's a little bit like, okay, this isn't as tiring as like schlepping up to the kids' rooms and, whatever.
Yeah.
So I'll climb into mom's bed and I'll read it. And I find that's another one of those, like, the kids are just, they feel so loved to be sitting in, and they're so honored, right? They're sitting in mommy and daddy's bed and they get to, and they're all like, they fight to be as close as possible.
So do you have a favorite book list or a good resource that you like to choose from when you're choosing books to read aloud?
I wish I could. I do a lot of, meaning I don't have one list. I couldn't be like, well, here's one list. But I do a lot of, borrowing from people's lists. So we do have a lot of collections in my library of just the various old school fairy tales. So if I'm just looking for something that's just, one chapter is it, and it's just, we do a lot of like Russian fairy tales, German fairy tales. Like some of them are a little, scary, but we do a lot of fairy tales. Just the way my kids are, I mean, they almost all like certain kinds of fantasy books, and so sometimes the fantasy cuts across both both groups. Both the boys and the girls like it. I don't know. I've kind of worked through. A lot. I guess nothing I'm going to say is going to be new to your readers, but I love reading the Anne of Green Gables books. Even my boys like them.
So
they're kind of funny.
Yeah, they are hilarious.
Although, like, they'd probably die if they heard me saying this, and they'd be like, "Is anyone going to know that?" A lot of historical fiction. The G.A. Henty, those old G.A. Henty books, are really great. So no, but I do, like, I'll go looking for classical book lists and that kind of thing. Do a lot of biographies of historical figures and saints and warriors and things like that, which I find, again, even the boys and girls will like that, because the girls like it because it's just inherently personal, like, oh, it's a person, it's gossip, it's like kind of like here's someone's life, right? And if you pick something that it's the boys like
Bethlehem books, are you familiar with them?
Which one?
Bethlehem books, they publish a lot of stuff across the spectrum. It's all historical, like living history kind of stuff.
Okay.
And I think they have a lot of great titles that are that appeal to both boys and girls, because they kind of appeal to that whole character-driven stuff, but with lots of wars and fighting and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously through the years coming in and out of homeschooling, I've relied a lot at different points in time on The Well-Trained Mind and some of the kind of the classics of the classic books that kind of present a wonderful kind of classical book list for parents, and kind of just dip into that. If you have like the one book, I'll kind of dip in and find things.
So I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are interested in what you do over there at Ave Maria University. Could you give us a little synopsis of what your campus is like and what you guys offer there? Sure.
The university is we're 10 years young, so just 10 years old, and we understand ourselves to be kind of building and providing a very strong classical liberal arts curriculum. We have a very large 2-year core curriculum, which is about as big as it can be if you're interested in the core curricula that are out there. There's a lot of great ones. 2 years is a lot of real estate, so that means for 2 years or 4 semesters, students take all the same courses.
Okay.
In the last 2 years, you can pick a major, and we have 30 some odd majors at the moment. So for example, if you major in economics here at Ave Maria, you'll take a curriculum in those last 2 years that looks very much like the curriculum you would have at any regular school, so to speak, any non kind of classical liberal arts school.
Okay.
Our campus culture is a lot like a lot of the great liberal arts colleges that you might be familiar with. We have a very artsy faculty. We'll put it that way on the humanities side. We do Shakespeare. We take Shakespeare very seriously here, for example, but we also take Shakespeare seriously as something to be acted and to be done as a play. So you can study Shakespeare within a literature major. You can study Shakespeare within the humanities major. You can study in humanities generally here, and you can also study Shakespeare within a minor in Shakespeare in performance. So if you want to just do Shakespeare as a performance subject, you can do that too. So that's kind of just to give you a flavor of kind of how the humanities works here. A lot of different faith backgrounds here. Although we're very much identified as a strong Catholic college, the last time I checked, we were about 85% Catholic in the student body. So there's a good depending on. So right now, maybe 150 or 200 students that are not Catholic. Come from a variety of other Christian and non-Christian backgrounds, and all of those things. And then I should also just mention that we people have a hard time envisioning where we are because most people don't spend a lot of time in South Florida. But our campus is extraordinarily beautiful. We're right on the border of the Everglades, the National Everglades.
Okay.
So what you should picture, I mean, a lot of students, they're thinking, okay, alligators and snakes. And yes, there are alligators and snakes on campus. But if you're not familiar with
Wow.
I turned you off. It's a tremendously interesting and cool place to be for 4 years. So, for example, our biology majors spend a lot of time out in the Everglades looking at things. We have kind of it's easy to do things that are related to marine biology because of our proximity to both, freshwater, like the Everglades is fresh, and then we've got the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic Coast very close by. So all the birds in the world come here in the winter. And so, the things I didn't know before I came here, but this is a very, very popular spot for bird watching, for example, and we see all kinds of neat things. And my children, for example, have just loved living here because of
because there's alligators on campus. So.
Partially, it's because of the alligators, but they've gotten into nature in ways that they didn't before we moved here. In part because you're outside all year here.
Right. Listeners, you can go to avemaria.edu to find out more about Ave Maria University.
Thank you.
So it has been a huge pleasure for me to talk with you today, even amidst all the technical difficulties that I lended to the conversation.
No problem. Thank you. It was definitely mutual.
Now it's time for Let the Kids Speak. This is my favorite part of the podcast, where kids tell us about their favorite stories that have been read aloud to them.
Hi, my name's Marissa Campbell. I'm 9 and I live in California. My favorite books are the Chronicles of Narnia, and I like them because they're fun and magical. My name is Greta, and I'm 6 years old, and I'm from Florida. My favorite book for people to read aloud to me is Winnie the Pooh. My favorite part is when Pooh falls out of a tree because he wants to get honey from a bee.
The Chronicles of Narnia and Winnie the Pooh. Very good choices, kids. Well, that's it for today's episode of the Read-Aloud Revival podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. This is just a ton of fun for me and hopefully very inspiring for you. Remember, show notes include links to everything we talk about in the podcast, resources, good book recommendations. You can find all of those at readaloudrevival.com, and just look for episode 9 to find the show notes we talked about in this episode. Hey, it's a huge favor for me if you go to iTunes and leave a rating or a review of the podcast. Just head to iTunes on your computer, look for Read Aloud Revival, and then there's a place for you to give a number of stars or to give a longer review, and either of those things is super helpful. I appreciate every one of you who do that. That's it for this time, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. We've got an awesome lineup for the fall, so see you very soon. Go build your family culture around books.